the two. The last talk is planting and maintaining seedlings in the field. I tried to talk previously about acorns and about seedling production. I kind of like to think that this is really where the rubber meets the road, because you can do everything you want in terms of collecting acorns, and you can grow good seedlings, but if you don't have good follow-up in terms of planting them and maintaining them in the field, all your efforts can be for naught. And certainly there have been some projects like that where they're just, it's a pretty harsh environment, and we'll talk about what you need to do to try to hopefully get these things up through the seedling up to the sapling stage. So planting in the field, just some generalizations, and then we're going to talk just about physically the planting when you want to do it. I do think that earlier is better than later, as I mentioned, that these, especially the white oaks, really, the acorns start growing quickly, and the seedlings, if you get them out there earlier in the season, they seem to get better established. The soil should be well saturated but not frozen. Handle seedlings carefully. Obviously, these are living things. They seem to be, fairly delicate. You don't want to let the root systems dry out. You don't want to physically damage the trees. You want to, and we talked a little bit more about J-rooting things. The two critical factors that I feel are really more important than the other ones are the limited moisture resulting from competing vegetation. So really dealing with trying to control that competing vegetation seems to be critical for at least 2 years, and then the damaged acorns and seedlings from a wide range of animals. And I'm going to talk about each of those subjects separately. So eliminating competing vegetation. There has been some research, some of it out of scientists UC Davis, that has looked at the fact that these darker green things are perennial bunch grasses. You can see a few of them. This picture probably taken, a little bit later than now, maybe early June, late May, when the annuals, which are these brown plants, start drying up. It's well recognized that the annual plants that are so common on California's hardwood rangeland are not native. They were brought here. They're introduced from the Mediterranean region. They were brought originally in feed stacks for livestock when the Spanish missionaries came. We're talking about brooms and rye and oats, things like that. They are plants that are well adapted to this environment, because California is very similar to the Mediterranean, which is characterized by cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. And so these plants have come here, and they've thrived and done very well. But people feel they've displaced a lot of these perennials. We heard Jim talk about projects to restore native perennial bunch grasses. There's a fellow down there that has been very active as hedgerow farms and has really pushed reintroducing perennials. And there's certainly been a lot of planting, but there's no going back. As I think Walt mentioned, 10 million acres of hardwood rangelands. We're not going to restore perennial bunch grasses to all of these. And so we have to deal with the introduced Mediterranean annuals. Annual plants complete their whole life cycle in a few short months. They essentially start growing about 2 months ago. They're really in full growth mode right now. The temperature's warm, the soils are still moderately moist, and then they're starting to set seed. And so you see a lot of the oats with seeds, the brooms and the rye, and these other plants, the foxtail barley, for instance, seeds a little bit early, and then the seed matures, falls into the ground, the plant dies, everything looks brown. Well, these plants are very competitive with the oaks, and there has been some research that has indicated that oaks have a much easier time when they're surrounded by perennial bunch grasses than they do when they're surrounded by these introduced annuals. And so one of the things we've found is that in this environment, these are pretty much predominantly annual plants. This is a little oak. That's a tough place to grow. I mean, the primary hardship is probably limited soil moisture. These plants complete their whole life cycle in the spring, and so they really deplete the soil moisture. There's less available for the oaks, and so that's a real concern. You can also imagine that these are getting so tall that they're actually shading out, and if this was was only 2 inches, really shading it out. So they also compete for light, and they compete for mineral nutrition. So all these things make it very tough for the oaks to get started. So what we have done is we've studied, well, what if you eliminate this competing vegetation? And we did a study where we used a McCloud to not only eliminate the existing plants, but to scrape the soil a little bit and get rid of the seed bank. And we did circles that were 2 feet around, 4 feet around, and this one looks like one that's 6 feet around. And we did find that certainly this does seem to make a big difference. When you have no weed control, the first year, we did plant 1-year-old plants that were about 1 foot tall. They grew, on average, a grand total of 1 centimeter. They basically just sat there. Whereas if you had a 6-foot circle, they grew about 1 foot. 23 centimeters, maybe that's closer to 10 inches. So, but that's substantial growth. These are non-irrigated. These are planted out here on the hardwood range, actually fairly near to where we'll be going this afternoon. And these are not significantly different, and generally in our recommendations we think that 4-foot diameter, 2-foot radius weed control is important to get these things initially started. Now, this is a picture of doing this. This can be tough, especially if you have rocky soil, and so that's not what I would recommend doing, especially when things are hard and compacted as they are on rangeland. So there are other ways of removing the weeds. There is mulch you can put down, and this is organic mulch, wood chips. There's also plastic mulches and other, we've used even tar paper and black plastic, which seems to work fairly well. There are contact herbicides. This is spraying of Roundup, and this is usually done in mid-February. Seems to be the first time. That's when you really get a flush of germinating plants, and if you spray them, they die. And this is fairly distinctive. Now try to remember this. This is actually a little study we'll be talking about in the field. It's called a Blue X planting, and we heard Jim talk about using Blue X tree shelters. There's some right over here. These are fairly inexpensive, but they're also not as sturdy or as substantive as Tube X tree shelters or other types of tree shelters. But the reason I'm showing this is fairly distinctive, kind of an orange color. This is probably 2-3 weeks after Roundup was sprayed. There are problems, though, with Roundup. It is a very non-discriminating herbicide. Pretty much kills everything. Any leaf that it touches, that gets translocated. It seems like you can spray over oaks when they're deciduous oaks, that is, that don't have any leaves and the buds are fully set. But we've had some mistakes with this. This is typical Roundup injury to blue oaks. I think we probably had some drift when the buds were swollen and getting active, and so you get this kind of elongated, kind of deformed look, and that's not good. It didn't kill these plants, but you definitely don't want to be spraying Roundup over the top of any oak seedlings that have any foliage or even swollen buds on them. And at the point of this slide, I really can't describe anything, but I think this picture was taken more in late May, and it's to indicate that they're not all weeds germinate at the same time. Generally, you get your grasses coming up fairly early in the season, but some of the more noxious weeds like Medusa head or like star thistle, mustard, turkey mullein, things like that, they're later germinating. And if you just spray in February, this site may well have been sprayed. You get these things coming up. So generally, if you're using a contact herbicide, you need to spray twice, and I would say usually mid-February and then mid-May would be another time to kind of get rid of the later germinating weeds. Okay, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about weed control. I think at least 2 years is a good time to do it. The main benefit of it is that you allow more soil moisture. You don't have the plants that are sucking the soil so dry, and it gives the oaks a chance to get started. I guess one other benefit is sort of interaction with animals. When you have this dense thatch, like I showed on that one slide, this creates a really good habitat for 2 animals in particular that are really damaging to oaks. One are grasshoppers, and they seem to like really heavy grass years. And if you have grass everywhere, you're liable to get heavy damage to oaks, especially if it's one of those, sort of like acorn crops. Populations of grasshoppers seem to be very sporadic, and you have outbreaks and then you have times when they're not so bad. Well, in an outbreak year, if you've done no weed control, you can get tremendous damage. The other ones are voles, and I have a picture of this in just a minute. They really like that thatch, and so if you can eliminate the thatch, you get less damage from those animals. Okay, that's an animal near and dear to our hearts here at the field station, because as Dustin mentioned, we do a lot of cattle research, and this place was originally established as a cattle research facility. I think oak restoration on hardwood rangeland, it's real important to address impacts of cattle, because 80% of the oak woodlands in California are privately owned, and the primary economic activity is livestock grazing. So you may hate them, you may say, you know, no moo in 2002. I think was actually, when I first heard that, was no moo in 92, when there was efforts to get cattle off the national forests. That's a whole another subject, so we won't talk about that. But you do need to address impacts from livestock if you're trying to restore oaks in an area where livestock are grazing. And this can be an impact. You can get this real heavy-duty browsing on oaks. It doesn't seem to, and I'm talking a little bit more about a study, how tall do the plants have to be before this isn't much of a problem. But when they're 2 feet, 3 feet tall, it can certainly be a problem. Deer, another huge impact, in especially where you have a resident deer herd. Over in Mendocino County at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, they have a resident deer herd, large populations of deer. It's really tough to get any oak started over there without protecting the plants from these deer. Here we have more of a migratory herd. They come down from the high elevations and then go back up. So we don't have the deer pressures, and it's really not that much of an issue. We have successfully established oaks even with deer having access to the plants we've grown. These are ground squirrels. They can be a problem. Ground squirrels certainly will eat acorns and can damage young plants. And look at that guy, isn't he so cute? This is a vole, California, Microtus californicus, but he's a dastardly beast, because you can see this is probably a sapling that's maybe 1 inch in diameter, this tall. You think you're home free, and then it'll come and girdle. It's a little hard to see, but you can see it's been girdled right there, it's been girdled right there. And if you have thatch around here, that's when you really get damage. Jim, you've probably seen some damage from voles too. Even when we've had plants that have been 8 feet tall, and these voles will actually, in some of these areas, will climb and will go up. I've seen damage up 4 feet in seedling, even not taller than that. So that can be a real problem. And grasshoppers, you can see grasshoppers chewed this leaf and can totally defoliate plants. So this is a picture taken from the California Agriculture magazine, the cover in 1989. We'll see these seedlings. This is 20 years from now, so we have pretty well established trees out here. Originally we used aluminum screen cages. That was kind of what people were using. We have little, you can see little oaks in here that are about 5 or 6 inches tall. They were grown in liners, and these worked pretty well for you know, keeping grasshoppers out, keeping voles away, keeping rabbits away, and deer also. But you know, any self-respecting cow would pull that up and trample that, you know, immediately out in a pasture. So they're no good with cattle. And we found that the seedlings would rapidly grow to the top, and then they'd get deformed. If you open these up, the grasshoppers would go down inside, and they would eat away, and they would browse all the leaves or eat all the leaves off the seedlings. So these aluminum devices haven't worked very well, which is too bad, because I have 400 or 500 foot rolls of this out in the shed, you know. I'll make you a deal if you want some springs. So there's some other ways you can exclude animals. I think this is from the Concord Naval Weapons Station, where they not only have deer and livestock, but actually a big herd of elk. And so you need to really do something to keep these animals out. You can see, though, that when you start eliminating grazing by large herbivores, you can get this buildup inside, so this can become a problem. We put tree shelters inside these to try to eliminate damage from smaller animals. And these are our tree shelters, and what we've kind of gone with. This again is another study where we looked at 2, 4, and 6-foot tree shelters, and then control plants that had no tree shelters. I've got some, these were established I think in 1994, so I've got some signs out there that show, and some of these were direct seeded acorns and some were seedlings. So you can see in the field what these have done. What we generally found is the tree shelters really seem to promote much more accelerated growth, and that they protect from a wide range of animals. We even are successfully able to protect from cattle if we use heavy metal fence posts. If you put a wooden stake on these, the cattle would knock them over. So you need to secure them. But in this area, even though they bend them, they lean against them sometimes, especially if there's nothing else to rub on, they generally don't knock them over. And with a little, maintenance, you can put them upright again, and they don't damage the plants too much. In a confined area, this isn't going to work in a feedlot. And it's not going to work even where you have high densities of animals, because they will impact these. But in low to moderately grazed pastures, these work fairly well. And this is another picture that was in Cal Ag. This is in a couple of years ago on the field day we did go up. We're not going to go see these. This is actually taken probably 10 years ago, because I think the same picture is on the cover of that Regeneration publication, which I think went to press in 99 or 2000. So as you can imagine, these are much, these where this is about 8 feet tall, they're probably 15 feet tall now, and we've had very good success getting oaks established with these. However, there are other types of tree shelters. There's Blue X, there's something called Plantra, there are Vexar things, and so you can kind of look at these, and we'll talk about that more in the field. Okay, the question arose in the last,
What are the shelters made out of that you have in the cattle and stakes in them?
They're made out of polypropylene, so they're made out of a plastic, and they're actually like cardboard. They're double walled, so they kind of insulate and they don't heat up quite as much.
You have to cut them off?
That's what we generally do, and I'll show you out in the field where we have cut some off. The question was about how tall do oaks have to be before they're resistant to, being really heavily browsed by cattle. And this is a study where there was an abandoned study that had been set up by Ted Adams, who'd done some oak research here, and we went out and we had about 150 plants, and we exposed some of them to cattle and some of them we left out. Well, subsequent to after we did this, we went out and we'd measured all the seedlings initially, and we started seeing a pattern. And the pattern was, if the oaks were less than 2 meters tall, they really were hammered by the cows. 2 meters, a little taller than me. If they were over 2 meters, they seemed to be resistant. So after a year, we went out and remeasured them, and we found that the ones that were 2 meters to start with grew 30 centimeters the next year. The ones that were less than 2 meters and suddenly exposed to cattle, the cattle hadn't had access to them for 10 years prior to that, they really impacted them, and they actually lost 30 centimeters. So how big they are seemed to have a big impact. I'm going to talk a little bit now about augering, fertilization, and irrigation. Augering, we've found, does help. You go down in the soil, mainly because the rangelands have a lot of been continuously grazed for well over 100 years, and they certainly are fairly compact, at least for a foot. So we've done a study, and this is a much easier way to auger, we've found, where I say, Dustin, we want the hole here, that works great, or Martin. But these little buggers, those are killers, especially in hard compact soil. But this is pretty easy. Well, we did a study where we augered to various depths, and you see first 2 years after planting the seedling, this should actually be height increment, I'm quite sure. These things grew about 10 inches, but on average these grew about twice as tall. We did not have significant difference between these three, but we certainly did between all of these and this one. And so I guess the take-home message for us was, if you can auger 10 10, 12 inches down, that's good. That gets you through that hard compact layer, and it helps the plants get established. Without any arguing, they do kind of, it takes them a while to grow down, though they eventually will do so. Fertilizer tablets are another. We've used 21-gram planting tablets. These are 20-10-5 in the percent of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, or NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, I guess. There's some of these that are over there. You can see them. They're very inexpensive, about $0.05 a piece. And this is what they look like. And again, second year after planting, this is the height increment. These guys grew about 16 centimeters. If they're fertilized, they grew about 35. And this is averaged over hundreds of plants, so it's statistically significant. Irrigation. We've done very little work with irrigation here, and we did one study where we irrigated some valley oaks, and what we found is, as Jim mentioned, if you irrigate, you can increase the height growth. But in our environment, except for this one study, we've never irrigated, except we sometimes have watered things in. If we're planting when the soil's really dry, we'll pour some water on an initial planting to let everything settle and make sure there's moisture. But we've done no more like seasonal irrigation except for this one study. And in this study, we found that we were able to get 100% survival without irrigation, but we could increase the height growth of valley oaks with irrigation. Dry water, something you've probably heard of. It's a starch polymer. It absorbs many times its own weight in water and then releases slowly. In a wildland setting, I don't think it really has much of a benefit. It's too dang expensive, and it doesn't seem to work particularly well. If you're going on vacation for 2 weeks and you want your house plants to stay better, this may be a good thing to use. But we have not found too much benefit of it for ours. In the one little study we did. So planting conclusions, you just can't plant and walk away. You do have to deal with weeds, you have to deal with animals, preventing animal damage, weed control critical. These can often help, but probably not essential, but they can help. Irrigation in this environment, and it's important to mention that we're in an annual 28-inch rainfall zone. This is pretty good rainfall compared to the southern part of the state, like in the San Joaquin area. You may have a real tough time without irrigating, but you must do weed control. Without weed control, you really probably are going to have to either. And I guess this is just a take-home message that it's much easier to not cut them down in the first place than it is to restore them. A lot of times you hear about this, well, we got a 30-inch valley oak and we're going to plant 30 little seedlings. Well, seedlings don't have the same ecological value as a large tree, and it takes a heck of a long time for these saplings to grow up to obtain those values that are important. So if there are opportunities to not cut down the trees in the first place, that's certainly an advantage. Okay. I did mention that livestock are on 80% of the rangeland, so cattle ranchers, they want to know how long must livestock be excluded, how long do seedlings need to withstand average impacts, how much forage will be lost. And this is that study I mentioned. We had this bank of seedlings ranging from ones that were just about 1 foot tall, this is about 3 feet tall, to these tall. And again, we found that 2 feet was different. Now this is another study that it's the last thing I'm going to talk about, and actually, okay, this is that study. I'm not going to go into it in detail. This is the different impacts. Basically, we started with these 150 seedlings, and we put them in different treatments, and we found that small ones, the cattle would rub on them, they'd stomp on them, they'd nibble on them, didn't do very well. But if they were big, like this tall, and that's my old colleague Jerry Tecklin, who couldn't be here today, but many of you remember him if you've been up here. This plant had pretty much no impact, the little ones did. Okay, and that's kind of the same thing. Conclusions, there are significant different impacts, and they're resistant within 2 meters. Keep cattle out until you reach this height if you want to protect the seedlings. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll go eat. A new approach Everything I've pretty much done and we've talked about has been artificial regeneration, starting with acorns, starting to plant them, growing new seedlings. Another approach is working with natural seedlings. Some years you will find lots of small seedlings out there. They may not grow up to be large saplings. Something seems to be limiting them. At least they've found that the real bottleneck seems to be between the seedling to getting them up to be a sapling, or 6-8 feet tall. So we thought, well, there are a lot of seedlings out there. Maybe we could enhance their growth. So we did a study to determine if these small volunteer seedlings could be helpful. And basically, we want to see if we could put tree shelters over these small seedlings, if we could provide weed control, and would it make any difference if the seedlings we were working with were under the canopy or in the open. Basically, we had 6 field sites. I mentioned the treatments. These are sites up here near Red Bluff. This is the Sierra Field Station. We have a site here. Jim knows this one. It's the Bobcat Ranch that's managed by Audubon Society over in Yolo County, just a little bit west of Davis. This is down in San Benito County. This is in San Luis Obispo County, Santa Margarita Ranch, and down in Santa Barbara County. And at each of these sites we had 144 seedlings like this. Some of them we fitted with tree shelters like Bill Ticci's doing here. Some we didn't. Some we had weed control. This is actually planting here at the field station, and you can see, well, you can almost see, this is a tree shelter and weed control, no tree shelter but weed control, tree shelter and no weed control, and out here there's a seedling with no weed control and no tree shelter. We've only had this study going for a little over a year, but already we found significant differences between the tree shelters promoted significantly better height growth, and the weed control promoted significantly better survival. Unfortunately, it's been kind of a drought, so we haven't seen, I think, the full impacts of the treatment, but we are going to follow this for a little bit, and hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that this is a good technique, and it's a cheaper technique. And we talked about genetics. Well, how local is local? Should I collect acorns from 20 miles away? Well, here you're working with, this acorn probably came from that blue oak right there. And all these acorns probably did. So it's definitely, you eliminate the genetic concerns and you eliminate the costs of collecting acorns, propagating seedlings, planting seedlings. So it's a much cheaper alternative. This is, that's the last slide. I did want to point out on a previous slide that I don't think I showed this, but the Integrated Hardwood Range Management Program does have a website where you can get lots of information about all the things we've talked, as well as, information about what each county is doing to protect oaks, or when the next oak symposium is, or the online issue of Oaks and Folks, which is in your packet. And if you just type in on your search engine IHRMP, you will get that. That's the last slide. Let's take a couple questions and then we'll go eat. Yes?
As far as weed control, what is your opinion of bare soil versus the weeds? Because a lot of sites that I work, we're unable to bring in outside sources of mulch.
Yes.
So we're left with either leave the annuals there to crowd out the trees, or to just take it down to bare soil.
Yeah. So the question was, if you really can't bring in mulch, and if you have all you have are annual plants there, but you do have an option of getting it down to bare soil, what's the better? I would definitely say the bare soil. I don't think there's, if you were making a whole 100 acres bare, then you're going to have erosion problems and concern like that. But bare soil in the vicinity of the oaks is not only good from maintaining more soil moisture, but we found that a 4-foot circle prevents vole damage, and we've done a study on that where voles are reluctant to cross 2 feet to go eat on an oak because they're raptors, they're coyotes, they're things. They really love it in the thatch. So having that bare area really not only creates better soil moisture conditions, but more protection from some animals.
And a lot of times we use the weeds to, once we pull them,
yeah. Okay, yeah, that's, using the weeds for the mulch is good too, as long as the seeds haven't matured, because, that's the difference between hay and straw. Straw is great because you don't have any seeds, but hay isn't so good because you got all these seeds and they're just going to germinate and grow. Yes?
graded sites, have you found success with soil additives and that sort of thing?
Okay, graded sites, certainly with development, there's often changes in grade, and you know, we did a study down on at a place called Rossmore in Walnut Creek where we did some different, you know, graded, backfilled, volunteer. We found that in even, you know, soils where the grade was significantly changed or it was either added to or reduced, we could successfully get oaks to grow. I think we generally just used the native soil. We didn't bring in other soil, but oaks seem to have an ability to grow in a wide range of different types of soils and potting mixes, and it seems like in terms of growing seedlings in containers, it's better to have a well-drained, sort of coarse planting mix than it is something that, you know, has more clay and more moisture holding capability. So if you are going to add it, I think organic material, you know, any of the mulches that you'd plant flowers in or things like that would work fairly well. Maybe in the field we can have some arborists or restoration who've had some experience can comment on that too. Yeah?
You didn't answer about canopies you started.
About what?
The value of planting under a canopy.
Oh, okay, yes. It seems like, you know, it's real preliminary, but it seems like oaks, you know, they like a fair amount of light, and so if you put them, they're fairly intolerant of shade, and it seems like one of the benefits, the thing that I think is going to be the most significant for improving the growth are the tree shelters. Well, the tree shelters, even if they're white, they reduce light intensity by a good 50%, so if you put them under a canopy, you're already reducing with light. So it does seem like that naturally the oaks start really taking off when they're out at the drip line or beyond. So it seems like the best places to plant are slightly outside the canopy. Okay, we'll take two more questions and then we're going to go right here. Yeah?
Quick question on the protection of the young oaks from deer, cowboys, etc.
Yeah.
You showed the plastic collars up to 6 meters, good height. Unfortunately, that high, they're really well going to take off. The question I have is, if the labor and cost going to try to protect the fuse, notwithstanding, it's better to actually have wire, less lighting, more direct, rather than take plastic.
Yeah. Okay, the question is wire better for the growing environment for the plants? Because you don't have, I mean, the tree shelters create a bit of a different tree. They create a very long, narrow tree without any branches at the bottom. And there was some thought that, you know, if you take that tree shelter off right away, the plant falls over because they really grow tall and spindly. What we've found is if they grow outside the top of the tree shelter for a bit, they develop that girth and they stand upright. So if you use tree shelters, it's better to leave them in place for at least 2 or 3 years after the plant emerges from the top. In terms of the actual growth and how things grow inside a tree shelter versus in a wire environment, we've found that in tree shelters they really grow fast, and I think that's an advantage. Height growth from an acorn to the top of the tree shelter, 4-foot tree shelter in 1 year is not uncommon, and you wouldn't find that in a wire cage. So they do, I think the tree shelters really promote rapid growth, which in the long term I think is good because it gets them up to the size where they're less vulnerable to the pressures on animals. Now, it does cause some physiological changes, but as long as they grow out of that tree shelter for a couple of years before you take it off, I think the plant adjusts to the environment and does fairly well. Now, you know, one alternative is to take the tree shelter off when it gets to be 3-4 feet and then let the ambient conditions, and that may work well, but you're probably going to have to stake that tree. And if that's not a problem, that might work fairly well also. Okay, yes, and that.
How long do you think it would be with tree shelters in place
Yeah.
for the trees to be resistant to walls?
Good question. What we've found, well, I think you probably want the tree to be 2 to 3 inches in diameter at the base, 2 inches, say, before they're resistant to voles. Now, maybe that's a little on the big side. You know, even 1.5 inches, the bark gets harder. But we've found that when you use tree shelters, after, let's say you plant it, the plant gets out of the top after 2 years, you leave it on 3 more years, so 5 years. Instead of taking the tree shelter completely off, we take it down to about 10 inches and then cut it off. Leave that collar at the bottom, and that protects them from voles. Now,